The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and crimson as Maria Lightfoot walked barefoot across the sacred grounds of her ancestors. Her long black hair danced in the gentle breeze, and her deep brown eyes reflected both the wisdom of her 25 years and the burden she carried as the youngest tribal council member in Apache history. The reservation stretched endlessly before her, a land that had been home to her people for generations, yet now faced an uncertain future. Maria paused at the edge of the canyon where her grandmother used to tell stories of the old days, when Apache warriors rode freely across these very plains. The irony wasn't lost on her that today she would meet with a man who owned more horses than her entire tribe had ever seen, while her people struggled to keep even their basic needs met. The drought had lasted 3 years now, turning once fertile grazing lands into cracked earth and dust. Cattle died daily, and the tribal budget was stretched thinner than the morning mist that barely touched the desert floor. Across the valley, beyond the reservation boundaries, lay the Crimson Ridge Ranch, a sprawling empire that covered nearly 50,000 acres. Thomas McKenna had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single horse and a dream 40 years ago. Now, at 62, he was known throughout the Southwest as the man who could break any horse and heal any wounded soul that found its way to his ranch. His weathered hands had gentled thousands of wild mustangs, and his patient heart had given second chances to countless troubled young people who worked his land. But Thomas carried his own burden. His wife Sarah had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving him alone in a house that once echoed with laughter and the sounds of family dinners. Their only child, a daughter named Rebecca, had died in a car accident when she was just 23, the same age Maria had been when she first joined the tribal council. The pain of losing his family had left Thomas searching for meaning in his remaining years, wondering what legacy he would leave behind besides acres of land and herds of horses. The phone call had come 3 days earlier. Maria's voice had been steady but desperate as she explained the situation to Thomas. The tribal school needed a new roof before the next school year started, or 37 children would have nowhere to learn. The medical clinic required new equipment that the federal government had promised but never delivered. Most pressing of all, the tribe's elderly members needed proper heating for the coming winter, and the current system was failing after 20 years of patches and prayers. "We've exhausted every grant opportunity," Maria had told him over the phone, her professional composure barely masking the emotion underneath. "The state won't help, and the federal programs are backed up for years. I know this is unusual, Mr. McKenna, but we've heard about your generosity in the community. Would you consider meeting with us?" Thomas had agreed immediately, though he couldn't explain why. Something in Maria's voice reminded him of his daughter Rebecca's determination when she fought for causes she believed in. Rebecca had always said that true wealth meant having the power to change lives, not just accumulate possessions. As he hung up the phone, Thomas found himself thinking about the hundreds of horses that grazed his pastures, worth more money than many small towns saw in a year. The meeting was set for noon at the boundary between their lands, a neutral spot where the reservation fence met McKenna's property line. Maria had insisted on this location, refusing to ask him to come onto tribal land as a supplicant, but also unwilling to travel to his ranch as if seeking charity from a superior. This middle ground represented the respect between equals that she hoped would define their conversation. As the hour approached, Maria gathered her courage and the folder containing all the documentation of their needs. Medical reports showing the health risks to elders without proper heating. Engineering assessments of the school roof that painted a dire picture of what would happen during the next heavy rain. Letters from teachers explaining how they couldn't properly educate children when classrooms flooded and medical equipment failed during emergencies. Thomas arrived first, driving his old pickup truck rather than one of the newer vehicles in his fleet. He wanted this meeting to feel personal, not like a business transaction between a wealthy rancher and desperate tribal leaders. He stepped out of the truck and leaned against the fence post, watching the horizon where heat waves danced above the desert floor. The weight of his decision already pressed against his chest, though Maria didn't yet know what he was prepared to offer. When Maria appeared on the horizon, walking toward him with a steady, dignified pace, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. She moved with the same quiet confidence that Rebecca had possessed, the kind of inner strength that couldn't be taught or bought. Her simple jeans and white cotton shirt spoke of practicality rather than poverty, and the folder in her hands was organized with the precision of someone who had learned to make every detail count. Mr. McKenna, Maria said as she approached, extending her hand with a firm grip that surprised him with its strength. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Please, call me Thomas, he replied, noting how her dark eyes seemed to look directly into his soul without making him feel judged or uncomfortable. I've been thinking about your phone call since we spoke. They found shade under a large cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the drought, its roots running deep enough to find hidden springs. Maria opened her folder and began to explain the situation in detail, showing him photographs of children learning in classrooms with buckets catching rainwater, elderly tribal members wrapped in blankets because their heating systems couldn't keep up with desert cold, and medical equipment that belonged in a museum rather than a functioning clinic. We're not asking for charity, Maria said carefully, her voice carrying the pride of her ancestors. We're hoping to find a way to work together, perhaps some kind of arrangement that benefits both our communities. Thomas listened to every word, studying the photographs and reading the reports she shared. He saw the dignity in how she presented their needs, never making her people sound helpless but instead showing how they had fought to solve these problems themselves before reaching out for help. The tribal council had organized fundraisers, applied for grants, and even sold some of their ceremonial artifacts to museums to raise money, but the needs were simply too great for their limited resources. How much would it take to fix everything? Thomas asked quietly, setting the papers down on his knee. Maria had prepared for this question, but actually saying the number out loud made her stomach tighten with anxiety. $250,000 would cover the school roof, new heating systems for all the elder housing, and the medical equipment we need most urgently. Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered face giving away nothing of what he was thinking. $250,000 represented a significant sum, but not one that would threaten his ranch's financial stability. He had spent more than that on a prize stallion just last year. But this wasn't about money, this was about finding a way to honor Rebecca's memory while respecting the pride and independence of Maria's people. I have a proposition for you, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Maria lean forward slightly. But it's not what you might expect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert as Thomas explained his idea. He had been thinking about it since their phone call, an idea so unusual that he had almost dismissed it as foolish. But the more he considered it, the more it seemed like exactly what both communities needed. I have over 1,000 horses on my ranch, Thomas began, gesturing toward the rolling hills of his property. Some are worth more than most people's houses, bred from champion bloodlines and trained by the best horsemen in the country. Others are rescue horses, saved from slaughter or abandonment, given new life and purpose here. Maria waited patiently, unsure where this was leading but sensing that something significant was about to be offered. Your tribe has a historical connection to horses that goes back centuries, Thomas continued. The Apache were some of the finest horsemen the world has ever known. My proposition is this: I'll provide the $250,000 you need, but, in exchange, I want your tribe to take possession of my entire herd for one night. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. I don't understand. One night, Thomas repeated, his voice growing stronger with conviction. From sunset to sunrise, every horse on my ranch becomes the property of your tribe. You can do with them whatever you choose. Keep them, sell them, set them free, the decision is entirely yours. After that one night, whatever horses remain come back to me, and we never speak of this arrangement again. The offer was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that Maria found herself speechless for the first time since becoming a tribal council member. The value of Thomas's horse herd was estimated in the millions: thoroughbreds, quarter horses, Arabian stallions, and rescued mustangs that had been lovingly rehabilitated. The legal implications alone made her head spin, but beyond that was the deeper question of why a successful rancher would make such an extraordinary offer. Why would you do this? Maria asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked toward the horizon where his ranch spread endlessly under the desert sky. Because I lost my daughter 2 years after my wife died, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with all this. He gestured broadly at his land and horses. Rebecca always said that true wealth meant having the power to change lives. This seems like something she would have wanted me to do. The emotion in his voice was unmistakable, and Maria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she began to understand the depth of his offer. This wasn't just about money or horses, this was about healing, legacy, and the kind of trust that rarely existed between communities that had often been at odds with each other. There would need to be legal protections, Maria said slowly, her practical mind beginning to work through the implications. Insurance, liability issues, transportation logistics. This isn't something that could be decided quickly. I've already spoken to my lawyers, Thomas replied with a slight smile. They think I've lost my mind, but they're drawing up the papers. The offer stands for 30 days. If your tribal council agrees, we can make it happen within a week of your decision. As the afternoon wore on, they sat under the cottonwood tree discussing the practical details of an arrangement that seemed to defy common sense but somehow felt absolutely right to both of them. Thomas explained that his ranch hands would help with the transfer, ensuring that every horse was properly documented and cared for during the transition. Maria asked dozens of questions about the logistics, the timeline, and the legal framework that would protect both parties. Some of my horses are worth more individually than your entire tribal budget, Thomas said honestly. There's a stallion named Thunder's Promise that cost me $300,000 at auction. There are Maras with bloodlines that trace back to horses owned by kings. But there are also 23 Mustangs that I rescued from Bureau of Land Management holding facilities, horses that were destined for slaughter before I brought them here. Maria listened to each detail, understanding that Thomas was giving her a complete picture of what he was offering. This wasn't a trick or a test, it was a genuine opportunity for her tribe to receive exactly what they needed while participating in something that honored both their heritage and his desire to create meaningful change. I need to present this to the tribal council, Maria said as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. This decision affects everyone in our community. Of course, Thomas agreed, standing and brushing dust from his jeans. Take all the time you need. But, Maria, he paused, using her first name for the first time that day, I want you to know that regardless of what your council decides, I respect what you're trying to do for your people. That kind of leadership takes courage. As they parted ways at the fence line, both Maria and Thomas felt the weight of what had been discussed settling over them like the approaching desert evening. The offer would change everything, not just for the immediate needs of the tribal community, but for the relationship between two groups of people who had shared this land for generations while rarely truly connecting. That night, Maria sat on her grandmother's porch, looking out over the reservation toward the lights of McKenna's ranch house in the distance. The folder of documentation lay beside her, but her mind was no longer focused on roof repairs and heating systems. Instead, she found herself thinking about horses running free under starlight, about the weight of trust between strangers, and about the kind of courage it took to accept help that came wrapped in such an extraordinary package. Tomorrow she would present Thomas's offer to the tribal council. Tomorrow the real work of decision-making would begin. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, Maria allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stand among 1,000 horses and know that for one night, they belonged to her people, not as property to be owned, but as living symbols of the independence and dignity that had always defined the Apache way of life. The tribal council meeting hall buzzed with nervous energy as community members filed in for what many were calling the most important gathering in a generation. Word of Thomas McKenna's extraordinary offer had spread through the reservation like wildfire, creating divisions that hadn't existed just days before. Maria sat at the front table, watching faces she had known since childhood display emotions ranging from excitement to suspicion to outright fear. Elder Robert Crowfeather, at 83 the oldest member of the tribal council, raised his weathered hand to call for silence. His grandfather had been alive when the last wild Apache bands were forced onto reservations, and his deep-set eyes held memories that stretched back through generations of struggle and survival. The silver braids that framed his face caught the fluorescent light as he spoke in the traditional Apache language before switching to English for those who had never learned the old tongue. We are here to discuss an offer that our young council member has brought to us, Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. But, before we talk about horses and money, we must remember who we are and where we come from. Our ancestors rode horses across these lands when they were free. They understood that horses were not possessions but partners, spirits with their own power and dignity. Maria felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders as community members turned to look at her. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, consulting with lawyers, researching precedents, and trying to understand all the implications of Thomas's proposal. But, more than the legal complexities, she had wrestled with the emotional and spiritual dimensions of what was being offered. The practical needs are clear, Maria began, standing to address the room. We need $250,000 to fix our school, heat our elders' homes, and purchase medical equipment that could save lives. Mr. McKenna has offered to provide this money in exchange for something that has never been attempted before, the temporary transfer of his entire horse herd to our tribe for one night. Silence filled the room as people absorbed the magnitude of what was being discussed. 1,000 horses represented more wealth than most tribal members had ever imagined, but it also represented responsibility, risk, and a level of trust that crossed cultural boundaries in unprecedented ways. Joseph Windwalker, a Vietnam veteran who managed the tribe's small cattle operation, was the first to speak. I've dealt with McKenna's ranch hands at livestock auctions. They're good people, but this doesn't make sense from a business perspective. Nobody gives away millions of dollars worth of horses, even for one night. There has to be a catch we're not seeing. His skepticism was echoed by several other voices. Sarah Two Eagles, who taught at the tribal school, worried about the legal liability. What happens if one of those horses gets injured while they're technically ours? What if someone gets hurt? We don't have insurance for this kind of thing. But Michael Stormcloud, a young man in his early 20s who had been working with horses since childhood, saw the offer differently. This could be about more than money, he said quietly. My grandfather always told stories about the days when our people were known throughout the Southwest for our way with horses. Maybe this is a chance to remember that part of ourselves. The debate continued for hours, with practical concerns mixing with deeper questions about identity, pride, and the nature of gifts that seemed too generous to accept. Maria listened to every voice, taking notes and trying to address concerns as they arose. She had brought copies of the legal documents that Thomas's attorneys had prepared, outlining every detail of the proposed arrangement and the protections built in for both parties. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the tribe's physician who traveled from Tucson twice a week to run their clinic, spoke with quiet urgency about the medical equipment they desperately needed. I've been treating people with equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago, she said. Last month I couldn't properly diagnose Mrs. Garcia's heart condition because our EKG machine is too old to give reliable readings. This offer could literally save lives. The room fell quiet as people considered her words. Everyone knew families who had suffered because of the inadequate medical facilities. The nearest full-service hospital was 90 miles away, and emergency situations often became tragedies because of the time it took to get proper care. Robert Crowfeather spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of years spent watching his community struggle with problems that money could solve. I have lived long enough to see many offers that seemed generous but carried hidden costs. But I have also seen what pride costs when children cannot learn properly and elders suffer in the cold. Perhaps the question we should ask is not why this man makes this offer, but whether we have the courage to accept help when it comes in an unusual form. As the discussion continued into the evening, Maria found herself thinking about her conversation with Thomas under the cottonwood tree. She remembered the pain in his voice when he spoke of his lost daughter, and the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about the rescued Mustangs on his ranch. This wasn't a business transaction for him any more than it was for her community. Young Maria Lightfoot's cousin, David Running Bear, who worked as a mechanic in town, raised a concern that had been bothering several community members. What if this is some kind of publicity stunt? Rich white guy helps poor Indians, makes himself look good for the newspapers? I don't want our community turned into a feel-good story for people who've ignored us for decades. Maria understood his concern, but she also remembered the quiet way Thomas had spoken about his offer, without any mention of publicity or recognition. Mr. McKenna specifically requested that this arrangement remain private, she said. He's not looking for publicity. If anything, he seems to want the opposite. The debate stretched past midnight, with the room gradually emptying as community members needed to get home to families and jobs. But the core council members remained, along with several elders whose opinions carried special weight in matters affecting the entire tribe. As the hours passed, a consensus began to emerge around a modified version of the proposal. Council member Patricia Blue Sky, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, finally spoke up with an idea that seemed to bridge the concerns of skeptics with the needs of the community. What if we accept Mr. McKenna's offer, but use this as an opportunity to create something lasting for our young people, she suggested. Instead of just taking the money and moving on, we could establish a horse program that teaches our children about their heritage while also providing job training and college scholarships. The idea energized the room in a way that surprised even Maria. Suddenly, people were talking about possibilities rather than just problems. Michael Stormcloud volunteered to research horse training programs at other tribal communities. Sarah Two Eagles suggested incorporating traditional Apache horse culture into the school curriculum. Even Joseph Windwalker admitted that a well-run horse program could eventually become financially self-sustaining. Robert Crowfeather smiled as he watched the younger generation take ownership of an idea that honored both practical needs and cultural heritage. "This is what the old ones hoped for," he said softly. "Not just survival, but the blending of old wisdom with new opportunities." As dawn approached, the tribal council reached a preliminary decision to accept Thomas McKenna's offer, with the understanding that the arrangement would be the foundation for a longer-term partnership focused on education and cultural preservation. Maria was tasked with returning to Thomas to discuss the additional elements that the council wanted to include. But, first, there was the matter of the horses themselves. The council decided that during their night of ownership, they would do something that honored both the animals and their own heritage. Rather than seeing the horses as property to be managed or sold, they would spend the night in ceremony, with tribal members sharing stories, songs, and prayers that connected them to their ancestors' relationship with horses. Elder Robert Crowfeather would lead a traditional blessing ceremony at sunset, welcoming the horses as temporary members of the tribal community. Throughout the night, different families would take turns watching over groups of horses, not as guards or caretakers, but as hosts honoring important guests. At sunrise, there would be a ceremony of gratitude before the horses returned to Thomas's care. The decision felt right to everyone present, combining practical problem-solving with spiritual meaning in a way that respected both the gift being offered and the dignity of the people receiving it. Maria felt a deep sense of relief as the council members finally began to head home, but she also felt the enormous responsibility of making this unprecedented arrangement work. 3 days later, Maria drove to Thomas McKenna's ranch house for a follow-up meeting that would determine whether their unusual partnership could really become reality. The ranch headquarters sat on a hill overlooking thousands of acres of carefully maintained pastures where horses grazed in the early morning light. The sight took her breath away, so many horses in one place, their coats shining in the sun, their movements graceful and free despite the fences that contained them. Thomas met her at the front door of a house that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. The rooms were filled with photographs of horses and family, saddles and bridles that showed years of use, and books about everything from veterinary medicine to Apache history. Maria noticed a well-worn copy of An Apache Lifeway by Morris Opler sitting on his coffee table, bookmarked and annotated in the margins. "You've been studying," she observed with a slight smile. Thomas looked embarrassed. "I realized I knew very little about your people's actual history. I wanted to understand what this offer might mean from your perspective." They sat in his kitchen over coffee and homemade biscuits while Maria explained the tribal council's decision and their additional ideas about creating educational opportunities. Thomas listened carefully to every detail, asking thoughtful questions about implementation and long-term sustainability. "I think your council is wise to look beyond the immediate exchange," Thomas said. "This could be the beginning of something much more meaningful than a one-time transaction." As they talked, Maria began to understand that Thomas had been hoping for exactly this kind of expansion of their arrangement. His interest in Apache history wasn't casual curiosity, it was the foundation for a vision he had been developing about ways that their communities could benefit each other over time. "I've been thinking about offering internships to young tribal members who want to learn about horse training and ranch management," Thomas said. "Some of my best workers over the years have been young people who just needed someone to believe in them. If your community is interested, we could create a formal program that provides job training along with college scholarships." The conversation continued for hours, with both Maria and Thomas discovering that their communities had complementary strengths and needs. The tribal community had young people eager for opportunities and elders with traditional knowledge about horses that was being lost. Thomas's ranch had facilities, expertise, and financial resources, but lacked the kind of cultural connection to horses that had been preserved in Apache oral tradition. By the time Maria left that afternoon, they had outlined a partnership that would extend far beyond the initial exchange of money for temporary horse ownership. The one night with the horses would be a symbol of trust and mutual respect, but it would also be the beginning of an ongoing relationship between two communities that had shared the same land for generations while rarely truly connecting. That evening, as Maria drove back toward the reservation, she found herself thinking about the stories her grandmother had told about Apache horsemen who could communicate with their mounts in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Tomorrow she would call a final tribal council meeting to approve the expanded partnership with Thomas McKenna. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to stand among 1,000 horses under the desert stars, knowing that for one night they belonged to her people not as possessions, but as partners in a ceremony that honored both the animals and the ancient relationship between horses and the Apache spirit. The morning of the transfer dawned clear and cool, with the desert sky painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise something extraordinary was about to unfold. Maria arrived at the boundary fence between the reservation and McKenna's ranch before sunrise, carrying a leather satchel that contained the legal documents, ceremonial sage, and a small pouch of corn pollen that her grandmother had given her for blessing new endeavors. Thomas was already there, leaning against his pickup truck and watching his ranch hands make final preparations for what they were calling the most unusual day in the history of American ranching. 18 experienced horsemen, most of whom had worked for Thomas for over a decade, had volunteered to help with the transfer despite their confusion about why their boss was temporarily giving away a fortune in horses to people he barely knew. "Morning, Maria," Thomas called out as she approached, his voice carrying both excitement and nervousness. "The boys think I've finally lost my mind, but they're ready to help make this happen." Behind him, a convoy of horse trailers stretched along the ranch road, each one representing thousands of dollars in transportation equipment that would be used to move the horses the short distance onto tribal land. The logistics had taken weeks to organize, with veterinarians standing by to examine each animal and insurance representatives documenting every detail of the unprecedented transfer. Jake Morrison, Thomas's ranch foreman and closest friend for 30 years, walked over to join them at the fence line. His withered face showed the kind of deep skepticism that came from a lifetime of practical experience, but his loyalty to Thomas was absolute. "Boss, I've followed you through some crazy ideas over the years, but this one takes the prize." "You sure you know what you're doing?" Thomas clapped his friend on the shoulder. "Jake, I haven't been sure of anything since Sarah died. But this feels right in a way I can't explain. Sometimes you have to trust your heart over your head." As the sun climbed higher, representatives from both communities began gathering at the transfer site. Maria had brought 5 tribal council members, 3 elders who would conduct the blessing ceremony, and a dozen young people who had volunteered to help care for the horses during their one night on reservation land. The mix of generations reflected the importance that the tribal community placed on this event as both a practical solution and a cultural milestone. Robert Crowfeather arrived wearing traditional ceremonial dress, a hand-beaded vest that had belonged to his grandfather and a feathered headdress that caught the morning light like something from a dream. The 93-year-old elder moved slowly but with dignity as he approached the fence line where two cultures were about to intersect in a way that neither community had ever experienced. "In the old days, horses came to our people as gifts from the Creator," Robert said in Apache before switching to English so Thomas could understand. "Today we receive them again as gifts, but from a friend who honors our traditions by trusting us with what he values most." The blessing ceremony began with the burning of sage and traditional songs that echoed across the desert landscape. Maria translated for Thomas as Robert explained that in Apache tradition, accepting such a gift created a sacred obligation to protect and honor what was being entrusted to them. The horses weren't being transferred as property but as living beings whose welfare would temporarily become the spiritual responsibility of the tribal community. Thomas found himself deeply moved by the ceremony, understanding for the first time that he wasn't just giving away horses for one night, he was participating in something that connected him to traditions that stretched back centuries. When Robert invited him to participate in the blessing by sprinkling corn pollen over the first horses to be transferred, Thomas felt tears gathering in his eyes as he thought about how his daughter Rebecca would have loved this moment. The actual transfer began at noon with the most valuable horses going first. Thunder's Promise, the magnificent black stallion worth more than most houses, stepped carefully down the trailer ramp onto tribal land as if he sensed the significance of the moment. His coat gleamed in the desert sun, and his intelligent dark eyes seemed to take in every detail of his temporary new home. Maria stood beside the stallion as Jake Morrison handed her his lead rope, the legal transfer complete in that simple gesture. For the next 22 hours, this $300,000 animal belonged to her tribe, along with every other horse that would follow him across the boundary line. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but it was balanced by a deep sense of honor at being trusted with such magnificent creatures. "He's beautiful," Maria whispered, running her hand along Thunder's Promise's powerful neck. The stallion nickered softly and nuzzled her shoulder, as if already accepting her as his temporary caretaker. Thomas watched the interaction with satisfaction. "Rebecca would have loved him," he said quietly. "She always said that horses could sense a person's character." Thunder's Promise doesn't warm up to everyone that quickly. As the day progressed, trailer after trailer delivered horses of every description to the designated pastures on tribal land. Prize-winning quarter horses worth tens of thousands of dollars grazed peacefully beside rescued Mustangs whose only value was the second chance they had been given. Thoroughbred mares with bloodlines tracing back to legendary racehorses shared water troughs with gentle draft horses whose massive frames belied their calm temperaments. Each animal had been carefully documented and examined by veterinarians before the transfer, with detailed health records and ownership papers signed over to the tribal council. The legal complexity of temporarily transferring ownership of such valuable animals had required teams of lawyers working around the clock, but somehow every detail had been resolved. Young Michael Stormcloud worked alongside Thomas's ranch hands, learning techniques for handling high-strung thoroughbreds that he had never encountered in his limited experience with horses. The 22-year-old tribal member had grown up around the few horses that families on the reservation could afford to keep, but he had never imagined being responsible for animals that represented generations of careful breeding and training. "The key is to move slowly and keep your energy calm," explained Carlos Mendez, one of Thomas's most experienced horsemen. "These horses are used to being handled by professionals, so they expect you to know what you're doing even when you don't." By late afternoon, all 1,047 horses had been successfully transferred to temporary pastures that the tribal community had prepared over the past 2 weeks. Portable fencing, water tanks, and feeding stations had been organized with military precision, turning sections of the reservation into a temporary horse sanctuary that could rival any professional facility. The sight was breathtaking, hundreds of horses spread across the desert landscape, their coats shining in the golden afternoon light as they explored their temporary home. Families from throughout the reservation had come to witness the spectacle, with children pressed against fences in wonder and elders sharing stories about the days when Apache warriors rode horses just as magnificent across these same plains. As evening approached, Thomas prepared to leave the horses in the care of the tribal community, knowing that he wouldn't see them again until sunrise. The contract was clear: from sunset to sunrise, every horse legally belonged to the Apache tribe, to do with as they chose. The trust required for such an arrangement went beyond anything that money could buy or legal documents could guarantee. "Are you nervous?" Maria asked as they watched the sun begin to sink toward the western mountains. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I should be," he said finally. "I'm trusting you with everything I've spent 40 years building. But somehow I feel more at peace than I have since Rebecca died. Maybe this is what she meant about using wealth to change lives." The sunset ceremony began as the last light faded from the sky, with tribal members gathering in a large circle around the main pasture where Thunder's Promise and the other stallions grazed. Robert Crowfeather led traditional songs that thanked the horses for allowing themselves to be temporarily adopted by the Apache people, while younger tribal members shared stories they had learned about their ancestors' legendary horsemanship. Maria spoke to the gathered community about what this night represented, not just a financial transaction that would solve their immediate problems, but a bridge between their community and a man who had chosen to honor their heritage by trusting them with his most precious possessions. The money would fix their school and heat their elders' homes, but the relationships being built would last much longer than any building repairs. As full darkness settled over the desert, small groups of tribal members took shifts walking among the horses, not as guards but as hosts, ensuring their temporary guests felt welcomed and safe. The horses seemed to sense the peaceful intentions of their new caretakers, grazing calmly or resting in small groups throughout the improvised pastures. Michael Stormcloud found himself assigned to the section containing the rescued Mustangs, horses that had been saved from slaughter and given new lives on Thomas's ranch. These animals carried scars from their previous hardships, but they also possessed a wildness that connected them to the free-running horses of Apache legend. "You're home now, even if it's just for one night," Michael whispered to a scarred bay mare who had been rescued from a kill lot in Nevada. The horse lifted her head and looked directly at him, her dark eyes reflecting starlight and something deeper that he couldn't name. Throughout the night, tribal members rotated through shifts, ensuring that someone was always present with each group of horses. But this wasn't about security or management, it was about relationship, about honoring the trust that Thomas had placed in them and the spiritual responsibility they had accepted along with temporary ownership of his herd. Elder Robert Crowfeather spent the entire night moving slowly through the pastures, singing traditional songs and offering prayers for the horses' welfare. At 93, he should have been home sleeping, but he insisted that this was the most important night of his long life. The horses seemed drawn to his presence, gathering near the fence line when he approached and following along as he walked the boundaries of their temporary home. "They know," he told Maria during one of her check-ins. "Animals understand ceremony better than most humans do. These horses know they are participating in something sacred." As midnight approached, Maria found herself standing in the main pasture surrounded by horses that represented more wealth than her community had ever possessed, even temporarily. Thunder's Promise stood nearby, his massive form silhouetted against the star-filled sky like something from the ancient stories her grandmother used to tell. For this one night, he belonged to her people, along with every other horse in the herd. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the honor. Thomas McKenna had entrusted them with his life's work, his legacy, and his hope for the future. In return, her community was learning something about themselves that they had almost forgotten, that they were descended from people who understood horses not as possessions but as partners in a relationship that honored both species. As the night deepened, Maria walked among the horses and felt the presence of her ancestors who had once ridden freely across these same desert plains. Tomorrow would bring the practical work of transferring the money and beginning the construction projects that would improve life for her community. But tonight was about something more profound, the restoration of a relationship between the Apache people and the horses that had once been central to their way of life. Dawn arrived with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and the soft sounds of horses awakening in their temporary home. Maria had not slept at all during the night, spending the hours walking among the herds and watching over the animals that had been entrusted to her people's care. As the first light touched the eastern mountains, she felt both exhaustion and exhilaration, knowing that this extraordinary night was drawing to a close. Thunder's Promise stood at the fence line as if waiting for her, his magnificent head turned toward the rising sun. Throughout the night, the stallion had remained close to wherever Maria happened to be, as though he understood that she carried the responsibility for his welfare and that of every other horse in the temporary herd. When she approached him in the growing light, he lowered his head to allow her to stroke his neck one final time. "You're going home soon," she whispered to him, feeling tears gathering in her eyes. "But thank you for spending the night with us. You've given our people something we thought was lost forever." Across the pastures, tribal members were beginning to gather for the sunrise ceremony that would mark the end of their ownership and the return of the horses to Thomas McKenna. Elder Robert Crowfeather had remained awake throughout the entire night, moving slowly among the horses and singing traditional songs that seemed to keep both animals and people in a state of peaceful harmony. The old man's face showed his exhaustion, but his eyes sparkled with a joy that made him look decades younger. "In all my years, I have never felt closer to our ancestors," he told Maria as she joined him near the main gate. "These horses have reminded us who we are meant to be." Thomas arrived just as the sun crested the mountains, driving slowly along the ranch road with Jake Morrison and several other ranch hands following behind in pickup trucks loaded with halters and lead ropes. He had barely slept either, spending the night on his front porch staring across the valley toward the lights that marked where his horses were spending their one night under Apache care. The sight that greeted him took his breath away. More than 1,000 horses were spread across the temporary pastures in a scene that belonged in an epic Western movie rather than real life. But, more impressive than the horses themselves was the obvious care and attention they had received. Every animal looked calm, well-fed, and content, with no signs of stress or distress from their unusual night away from familiar surroundings. "I don't think I've ever seen them look this peaceful," Jake Morrison said in amazement as he surveyed the herds. "Whatever your friends did here, it worked better than anything we've tried." Maria walked to meet Thomas at the boundary fence, carrying with her the leather folder that contained all the ownership documents that had been signed the previous day. According to the terms of their agreement, this simple transfer of papers would restore his legal ownership of every horse, ending the Apache tribe's temporary possession of one of the most valuable horse herds in the Southwest. "How was your night?" Thomas asked, though he could see the answer written in Maria's face and in the contented behavior of his horses. "Magic," Maria replied simply. "Pure magic. Your horses taught our people something we had almost forgotten about ourselves." The sunrise ceremony began with Robert Crowfeather offering prayers of gratitude for the horses' safekeeping and for the trust that had made this extraordinary night possible. Tribal members who had participated in the overnight watch shared brief stories about their experiences, describing moments of connection with individual animals that had touched their hearts in unexpected ways. Michael Stormcloud spoke about spending hours with the rescued Mustangs, learning from their wariness and their gradual acceptance of human presence. "These horses have survived things that should have broken them," he said. "But they've found a way to trust again. That's something our people understand." Young Sarah Two Eagles, the tribal school teacher, described how she had spent part of the night telling traditional horse stories to a group of children who had been allowed to stay up for this historic occasion. "The children connected these horses to the stories their grandparents told them," she said. "For them, this wasn't about money or business deals. It was about coming home to something that had always been part of our identity." As the ceremony continued, Thomas found himself understanding that he had received far more from this arrangement than he had given. The sight of his horses being cared for with such obvious love and respect had shown him something about the true value of what he had spent his life building. These weren't just valuable animals, they were living connections to traditions and relationships that went deeper than ownership or profit. The actual transfer back to Thomas's ownership took most of the morning, with each horse carefully examined by veterinarians before being loaded into trailers for the short journey back to familiar pastures. Thunder's Promise was among the last to leave, seeming reluctant to step away from the fence line where Maria stood watching. "He knows he's leaving something special behind," Thomas said as he took the stallion's lead rope from Maria's hands. "Horses have long memories. He'll remember this night for the rest of his life." The legal documents were signed in a brief ceremony that formalized what everyone already understood, that the horses were returning to Thomas's care, but that the relationships built during their one night of Apache ownership would continue in ways that no contract could define. The money transfer had been completed electronically the previous day, with $250,000 deposited into the tribal council's account to fund the school repairs, medical equipment, and heating systems that had started this entire extraordinary process. But, as the last trailer pulled away from the reservation, both Thomas and Maria knew that the financial aspect of their arrangement was just the beginning. The conversations they had shared over the past weeks had evolved into plans for a long-term partnership that would benefit both communities while honoring the cultural heritage that had made this night possible. 3 months later, the transformation was evident throughout the reservation. The tribal school now boasted a new roof that kept classrooms dry during the harsh desert rains, while modern heating systems ensured that elderly community members could face the winter in comfort. Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked with new medical equipment that had already helped save 3 lives, including an accurate diagnosis of heart disease in an elder whose condition might have gone undetected with the old machinery. But, perhaps more important than these practical improvements was the establishment of the Apache Horse Heritage Program, a partnership between the tribal community and Thomas McKenna's ranch that provided job training, college scholarships, and cultural education for young tribal members. Michael Stormcloud had become the program's first coordinator, splitting his time between learning advanced horse training techniques at Thomas's ranch and developing curriculum that connected traditional Apache horsemanship to modern ranch management skills. The program had already attracted attention from other tribal communities and universities, with researchers interested in studying how traditional indigenous knowledge about horses could be preserved and applied in contemporary settings. Maria found herself traveling to conferences and meetings, sharing the story of how a simple request for financial help had evolved into something much more meaningful. Thomas, meanwhile, had discovered a new sense of purpose in his remaining years. Working with young tribal members had reawakened his passion for teaching and mentoring, reminding him of the joy he had felt when Rebecca was young and eager to learn everything about horses and ranch life. The partnership had given him a way to honor his daughter's memory while creating opportunities for young people who reminded him of her spirit and determination. The first scholarship recipients from the Apache Horse Heritage Program had enrolled in college programs ranging from veterinary medicine to business administration, with commitments to return to their community after graduation to build on what had been started. Sarah Two Eagles had developed a curriculum that taught traditional Apache horse stories alongside practical writing and care skills, creating a bridge between ancestral knowledge and contemporary opportunities. On the first anniversary of their one night together, Maria and Thomas met again at the boundary fence where their unlikely partnership had begun. The cottonwood tree that had provided shade for their initial conversation now stood as an unofficial monument to the trust that had made everything else possible. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked, watching Thunder's Promise graze peacefully in a nearby pasture. The stallion had returned to his normal routines, but Thomas swore that he still showed special interest whenever tribal members visited the ranch. "Only that we didn't do it sooner," Thomas replied honestly. "Rebecca always said that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to create opportunities for others. This past year has shown me what she meant." The Apache Horse Heritage Program had grown beyond anything either of them had originally envisioned, with partnerships developing with universities, other tribal communities, and ranch operations throughout the Southwest. Young people who might never have had opportunities to pursue higher education were now studying veterinary medicine, business, and agricultural sciences with full scholarships and guaranteed jobs upon graduation. But the program's success was measured in more than just college enrollment and career opportunities. Elder Robert Crowfeather had begun teaching traditional horse songs and stories to children who had never heard them before, preserving cultural knowledge that had been in danger of being lost. Families throughout the reservation had reconnected with their heritage through interactions with horses, rediscovering skills and traditions that their great-grandparents had taken for granted. The partnership had also created economic benefits that extended beyond the original $250,000 transfer. The Apache Horse Heritage Program had attracted visitors from around the world, including researchers, horse enthusiasts, and cultural tourists who wanted to learn about traditional Apache horsemanship. These visitors brought money into the local economy while creating additional opportunities for tribal members to share their knowledge and skills. Thomas had established an endowment fund that would ensure the program's continuation long after his death, with governance shared between the tribal council and a board of directors that included both Apache and non-native members. The fund had grown through donations from people who had heard about the partnership and wanted to support its mission of preserving cultural heritage while creating contemporary opportunities. As they talked under the cottonwood tree on that anniversary afternoon, Maria and Thomas reflected on how their lives had changed since that first phone call about a leaking school roof. Neither of them could have predicted that a desperate request for financial help would evolve into a partnership that was transforming two entire communities. "The children are different now," Maria said, thinking about the young people she saw every day at the tribal offices. "They have hope in a way they didn't before. They can see possibilities that extend beyond just survival." Thomas nodded, remembering his own daughter's dreams and ambitions. That's what Rebecca would have wanted, for young people to have the same opportunity she had, regardless of where they were born or what circumstances they faced. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats as Michael Stormcloud rode up on one of Thomas's quarter horses, wearing the confident smile of someone who had found his calling in life. The young man had become an expert horseman under Thomas's tutelage while also completing his college degree through the program's partnership with Arizona State University. "The new students arrive next week," Michael reported, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle. "We have 12 young people from 6 different tribal communities coming for the summer training program." Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she listened to Michael's report. The program had expanded to serve Native American students from throughout the Southwest, creating a network of partnerships that was preserving and revitalizing traditional relationships with horses across multiple tribal communities. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had marked the beginning of their partnership a year earlier, Maria realized that the most important thing about their arrangement hadn't been the money or even the horses. It had been the trust, the willingness of two communities to bridge cultural differences and work together toward shared goals. Thomas McKenna's offer of 1,000 horses for one night had been more than generous, it had been transformative. But the real transformation hadn't come from the temporary ownership of valuable animals. It had come from the recognition that healing, growth, and opportunity were possible when people chose to trust each other despite their differences. The Apache Horse Heritage Program would continue for generations to come, creating opportunities for young people while preserving cultural traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Thomas would eventually pass away, but his legacy would live on in the lives of the students he had mentored and the community partnerships he had helped establish. And Maria would remember forever the sight of 1,000 horses under the desert stars, belonging to her people for one magical night that had changed everything about their future. The horses had returned to their familiar pastures at dawn, but the connections forged during those precious hours would endure as long as there were young Apache people with dreams as vast as the desert sky and the courage to pursue them. In the end, it wasn't really about horses at all. It was about the recognition that healing comes through relationship, that trust can bridge any cultural divide, and that the greatest gifts are those that create opportunities for others to discover their own potential. Thomas had offered his horses for one night, but what he had really given was hope, and that was something that would last forever.